It is the year 1095. A pope stands on a wooden platform outside a cathedral in southern France, about to give the speech that will change the world. Within months, hundreds of thousands of people, nobles, knights, priests, peasants, will sell everything they own, leave everyone they love, and march 3,000 miles toward almost certain death. They will cross mountains, deserts, and siege lines. Most will not come back, and they will do it willingly. The question is not whether they were brave. The question is, what kind of world produces that? You have heard two answers to that question. One says the Crusades were Christianity's original sin, unprovoked aggression against a civilization that had done nothing to deserve it. The other says they were a heroic defense of a faith under siege long overdue, entirely justified. Both answers are wrong, not because the truth is somewhere in the middle, but because the truth is far more interesting than either side has been willing to admit. To understand what the Crusades actually were, you have to go back not to 1095, but 400 years earlier, to the world that made 1095 not just possible, but inevitable. To understand why hundreds of thousands of people marched to their deaths in the desert, you first have to understand what they believed they had lost. Not the theology of it, the geography. The actual physical world that existed before the event that made the Crusades inevitable. In the year 600, the Mediterranean Sea was a Christian lake. From the Atlantic coast of Spain to the deserts of Syria, from the cold shores of Anatolia to the sands of North Africa, the faith that had begun in a small Roman province 4 centuries earlier had become the dominant religion of the known world. The cities that anchored this world were ancient and wealthy. Alexandria in Egypt was one of the greatest centers of learning ever assembled. Its scholars had produced much of what educated Christians read, prayed, and argued over. Antioch in Syria was the city where the followers of Christ had first been called Christians. Carthage in North Africa had produced Augustine, the theologian whose ideas would shape Western thought for 1,000 years. At the center of it all sat Constantinople. Founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 on the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, it was built to be the Rome of the New World, a city of 500,000 people, its skyline broken by domes and columns, its harbor alive with merchant ships from every corner of the known world. Its currency, the gold solidus, was so reliable that traders from Britain to India accepted it without question. It was, by any measure, the most powerful city on earth. The trade network that connected these cities was the inheritance of Rome. Roads, ports, and sea lanes knitted together a vast commercial world: grain from Egypt, silk from the East, olive oil from Spain, timber from the forests of Anatolia. The Mediterranean was not merely a body of water, it was an economic system, and Christianity sat at its center, the faith and the commerce inseparable from one another. Jerusalem stood apart from all of it. It was not the largest city, nor the wealthiest. But for the Christians of this world, it was the axis around which everything else turned: the city where Christ had lived, suffered, and risen. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site of the resurrection itself, drew tens of thousands of pilgrims every year from every corner of the Christian world. Men and women who sold everything they owned for the chance to stand in that place. This was not a simple or unified world. The Christianity of Constantinople and the Christianity of Rome had been arguing for centuries about theology, about authority, about who held the keys to heaven. The empire had fractured, its western half falling to Germanic kingdoms in 476, leaving a patchwork of barbarian successor states across France, Spain, and Italy. But for all its divisions, the Christian world shared a geography, a sea, and the unspoken conviction that the Mediterranean had been its home since the beginning and would remain so. Then, in the space of a single human lifetime, the assumptions on which that world rested were destroyed. Not slowly, not at the edges, but at the very heart of the Christian world, in the richest provinces, the oldest cities, the most sacred places. What came next was not a border dispute or a dynastic conflict. It was a transformation so complete that the world on the other side of it was almost unrecognizable from the one that had existed before. The Roman roads still ran, the harbors still stood, the churches were still full. But the political order that had held this world together, the empire, the trade routes, the assumption that the Mediterranean belonged to Christendom was about to be shattered by a force that no one in Constantinople, Rome, or Jerusalem had seen coming, from a direction no one had thought to watch. It came from the Arabian Peninsula, a region the Byzantine Empire had always considered peripheral. The Arabs were not unknown. They had served as soldiers in Roman armies, traded along the southern edges of the empire, and maintained a presence in the desert borderlands for generations. But they had never been a threat. They were too divided, too scattered, too far from the centers of power to matter. That calculation was about to prove catastrophically wrong. What changed everything was not an army, it was an idea. In the early 7th century, a merchant from Mecca named Muhammad began preaching a new faith: one God, one revelation, one community of believers bound by submission to divine will. Within his own lifetime, that idea had united the warring tribes of Arabia into a single political force. Within a century of his death, that force would conquer half the known world, and the Mediterranean would never be the same again. The speed of what followed was unlike anything the ancient world had experienced. In 636, Arab armies defeated the Byzantine forces at the Battle of Yarmouk and swept into Syria. Jerusalem fell in 638. Egypt fell in 642. The Persian Empire, Byzantium's great rival, exhausted by decades of mutual war, collapsed entirely by 651. Within a single generation, the Christian heartland of the Middle East had passed under new rule, and the losses were accelerating. For the Christians who remained in these lands, life continued but on different terms. They were permitted to practice their faith, but they were second-class subjects, required to pay a special tax levied on non-Muslims, barred from building new churches, excluded from public office. Over generations, under the quiet pressure of a system designed to make conversion the path of least resistance, the Christian majorities of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa slowly contracted not through mass violence, but through the steady arithmetic of disadvantage. By the year 700, the Christian world had lost Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and all of North Africa. It had lost Jerusalem. It had lost the trade routes that fed its cities, the grain supplies that fed its people, and the pilgrimage roads that sustained its faith. The Mediterranean, which had been a Christian lake for 3 centuries, was becoming a contested sea. And the forces that had taken all of this had not stopped moving westward into Spain, northward toward France, eastward into Central Asia, and no one in what remained of Christendom yet knew how to stop them. In the year 632, the Prophet Muhammad died in the city of Medina on the Arabian Peninsula. He left behind a community of believers, a body of revelation, and a political structure that had already unified most of Arabia under a single religious authority. What happened next unfolded at a speed that stunned the world, and its consequences are still being felt today. Within 2 years of Muhammad's death, Arab armies were moving north out of Arabia and into the territory of the 2 great powers that dominated the known world, the Byzantine Empire to the west and the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east. Both empires were exhausted. They had spent the previous 30 years locked in a grinding war against each other that had drained their treasuries, depleted their armies, and left their populations worn and restless. Neither was prepared for what was coming. The Byzantine army met the Arab forces at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, in the scorched river valleys of what is today southern Syria. The battle lasted 6 days. When it was over, the Byzantine position in the Levant had collapsed. The army that had held the eastern frontier of the Roman world for 3 centuries was broken, and the road to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt lay open. The speed of the defeat was not simply a military failure. It was the consequence of an empire that had been bleeding for a generation and simply had nothing left. The cities fell in quick succession: Damascus in 636, Jerusalem in 638, surrendered by the Patriarch Sophronius to the Caliph Omar himself, who entered the city on foot, refused to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre so that it would not be converted into a mosque, and guaranteed the safety of the Christian inhabitants. Egypt fell by 642. The ancient city of Alexandria, the greatest center of learning in the Christian world, passed under Arab rule without a major battle. The Persian Empire, struck simultaneously from the west, ceased to exist as a political entity by 651. It is important to be precise about what this meant for the people who lived through it. The Arab conquests were not, in most places, characterized by mass destruction or forced conversion. The Caliph Omar's conduct in Jerusalem set a pattern that was often, though not always, followed Christians, and Jews were permitted to remain, to worship, and to conduct their affairs. In exchange for the payment of the jizya, a tax levied specifically on non-Muslims, life continued. Markets stayed open, churches stayed standing. But the political world these people had inhabited had been erased, and the system that replaced it was not neutral toward their faith. The jizya was not simply a financial burden, it was a statement of status. Non-Muslims paid it precisely because they were non-Muslims. It was the price of toleration, a formal acknowledgement that they occupied a lower rung in the social order of the New World. They could not build new places of worship. They could not hold positions of authority over Muslims. They could not bear arms. Over time, under this sustained and structural disadvantage, conversion became the rational choice for anyone seeking to advance, to prosper, or simply to avoid the accumulated friction of second-class status. The transformation of the Middle East from majority Christian to majority Muslim took centuries, not decades, but the direction was never in doubt. The conquest of North Africa followed. Carthage, the great city of Augustine, fell in 698. By 711, Arab and Berber armies had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and swept into the Iberian Peninsula, destroying the Visigoth kingdom in a campaign of extraordinary speed. Within 7 years, almost the entire peninsula was under Muslim rule. The ancient Christian kingdoms of Spain, the heirs of Rome, the guardians of a Latin Christian tradition that stretched back to the earliest centuries of the faith, had been extinguished. For the Christians of the West, it was as if the edge of the world had caught fire. The advance did not stop at the Pyrenees. By 719, Muslim forces had crossed into what is today southern France, raiding deep into Frankish territory, burning churches, and driving populations before them. In 732, at the Battle of Poitiers, fought on the plains of central France, less than 200 miles from Paris, a Frankish army under Charles Martel met the advancing Muslim force and turned it back. It was one of the most consequential battles in the history of Europe. Had it gone differently, there would have been no Charlemagne, no medieval church, no Christendom in any form that the Crusaders would have recognized. But Poitiers was a check, not a reversal. Spain remained under Muslim rule. North Africa remained under Muslim rule. The Eastern Mediterranean remained under Muslim rule. 2. And the economic consequences of all of this were beginning to make themselves felt in ways that were slower and quieter than the battles, but ultimately more devastating to the Christian world than any single defeat. The Mediterranean trade network that had sustained the Roman and Byzantine world depended on open sea lanes. Grain from Egypt had fed Rome. Silk from the East had clothed its aristocracy. The ports of Syria and Palestine had been the entry points for the wealth of Asia. All of this required the sea to be safe. Under Roman rule, piracy had been stamped out, and the Mediterranean had functioned as a unified commercial space. Under the new political order, that unity was gone, and into the gap came raiders operating from bases along the North African coast and the islands of the Western Mediterranean. Arab forces seized Sicily beginning in the 820s, completing their conquest of the island by 878. From Sicily and from the North African coast, they raided the Italian mainland, with regularity capturing Taranto in 840, seizing Bari, striking at the ports and monasteries of the Adriatic coast. In 846, a raiding fleet sailed up the Tiber River and plundered the basilicas outside Rome itself. St. Peter's stripped of its treasures, the tomb of the apostle violated, the eternal city unable to protect its most sacred sites. The shock in the Christian world was profound. The economic effect of all this disruption was enormous. Historian Henri Pirenne argued in the 20th century that it was the Arab conquest of the Mediterranean, not the fall of the Western Roman Empire, that truly ended the ancient world and produced what we call the Dark Ages. His thesis has been debated and qualified by later scholars, but the core observation holds: the closure of Mediterranean trade routes impoverished Western Europe, isolated its kingdoms from one another, and produced the agrarian, fragmented, inward-looking world of the early medieval period. The darkness that descended on Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries was not a European failure. It was a consequence of geopolitical rupture. By the middle of the 11th century, a new force had entered the picture. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia who had converted to Sunni Islam, had swept through Persia, taken Baghdad, and turned their armies westward toward Anatolia. In 1064, they invaded the Armenian kingdom, reducing its ancient capital to ruins and driving its population southward into exile. In 1071, their army met the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV at Manzikert, in the highlands of eastern Anatolia, and shattered his forces. The emperor himself was captured. It was the single worst military defeat in Byzantine history. What followed Manzikert was not simply territorial loss, it was systemic collapse. The Byzantine civil wars that erupted in the aftermath of the defeat allowed the Seljuks to pour into Anatolia almost unopposed. Within a decade, they controlled most of the peninsula that had been the demographic and agricultural heartland of the Byzantine Empire for centuries. Cities that had been Christian for 1,000 years passed under new rule. Pilgrimage routes that had carried tens of thousands of faithful to the Holy Land every year became dangerous and then impassable. The world that had produced the Crusades was now fully assembled a Christian civilization that had been losing ground for 4 centuries, watching its holiest places slip beyond reach, and running out of reasons to believe that patience and prayer alone would be enough. In Constantinople, a new emperor was preparing a letter to Rome. It was not a letter he wanted to write. The Eastern and Western churches had formally broken with each other in 1054, a split over theology and authority that both sides had made irreversible with the language they used and the anathemas they exchanged. Asking Rome for help meant acknowledging that Byzantium could not save itself. It meant placing the fate of the Eastern Church in the hands of men who considered its theology defective and its patriarch illegitimate. Alexios Komnenos wrote the letter anyway. He had no choice. And in Rome, a pope, with his own reasons for wanting this particular problem solved, read it with great interest. The stage was set. 4 centuries of loss, fragmentation, and encroachment had produced a Christian world that was simultaneously more desperate and more capable of acting on that desperation than it had ever been before. The system had been building toward this moment since the day the armies of Islam first moved out of Arabia. What happened next was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. The men who answered the call at Clermont in 1095 were not madmen or fanatics, operating outside the logic of their world. They were the product of that world shaped by 4 centuries of loss, encroachment, and a faith that had watched its holiest places slip beyond reach and its most sacred see become someone else's. To judge them without knowing that world is to misunderstand everything about what they did and why so many of them were willing to die for it. While the Islamic world was expanding across 3 continents, the Christian West was fighting for its life. Not against a single enemy, not in a single place, but on every frontier at once, from the frozen coasts of Ireland to the river valleys of Germany to the sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean. The world that would eventually march to Jerusalem was not born in comfort. It was forged in a century of almost unrelenting crisis, and the institutions it produced were shaped by that crisis in every detail. It had not always looked this way. For a brief and extraordinary moment in the late 8th century, Western Europe had found unity under a single ruler. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, had built by force and by faith the largest empire the West had seen since Rome, stretching from northern Spain to the borders of Denmark, from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Slavic world. He had been crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome on Christmas Day, 800, and for a generation, the idea of a unified Christian West had seemed not just possible, but real. It did not last. Charlemagne died in 814, and the empire he had built began to fracture almost immediately. His son, Louis the Pious, struggled to hold it together. His grandsons did not even try in 843. By the Treaty of Verdun, they divided the empire into 3 parts, each to be ruled separately, each to be defended alone. The great unifying project of the Carolingians was over. Western Europe was once again a mosaic of competing kingdoms, and into that fragmented, weakened landscape came a generation of invaders that drove the Christian world to the edge of collapse. From the north came the Vikings, Norse seafarers whose longships appeared without warning on the rivers and coasts of England, France, and Ireland. They burned monasteries, the great repositories of learning and wealth in the early medieval world. They enslaved populations. They occupied the mouths of the Seine and the Loire, sailing deep inland to strike at cities that had never imagined themselves within reach of a sea-borne raid. Paris itself was besieged in 885. The terror the Vikings inspired was so profound that monks across Europe added a new line to their liturgical prayers. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. From the east came the Magyars, nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppe, who crossed the Carpathian Mountains in 899 and began raiding the heartland of Europe with a ferocity that left entire regions depopulated. They struck deep into Germany, Italy, and France, their cavalry moving so fast that no conventional defense could stop them. For half a century, from their raids into Bavaria and Burgundy to their penetration as far west as Burgundy and Provence, the Magyar threat seemed as existential as anything Europe had faced. It was not until 955, at the Battle of Lechfeld, that the German king Otto I decisively defeated them and ended their raiding for good. From the south came the Arab and Berber forces already discussed raiding Sicily, the Italian coast, the Provençal ports. But they did something else as well. They established a permanent base at Fraxinetum on the coast of what is today southern France, from which they raided the Alpine passes for nearly a century, strangling the trade routes that connected Italy to the north and making the overland journey from France to Rome a gamble with life. The three-sided assault, Norse from the north, Magyar from the east, Arab from the south, was not coordinated. It did not need to be. The effect was the same. Out of this crucible emerged the institution that would make the Crusades possible: feudalism, the system by which land was granted to warriors in exchange for military service, was not a planned reform. It was an improvised survival mechanism, the answer a society gives when central authority has collapsed and the only protection available is the man with the sword who lives closest to you. Lords built castles. Knights swore oaths. Peasants surrendered their freedom in exchange for the security of a stone wall. The landscape of medieval Europe, its towers, its moats, its rigid hierarchies of obligation, was the physical residue of 2 centuries of existential fear. The warrior class this system produced was formidable, violent, and deeply difficult to govern. Knights were trained from childhood to fight, and in the absence of an external enemy, they fought each other, raiding neighboring estates, burning villages, settling personal grievances with lance and sword in the fields between their castles. The Church watched this with dismay. The very class that was supposed to defend Christian society was consuming it from within, and the popes and bishops who tried to impose order found themselves largely powerless against men whose entire identity was built around violence. The Church's first attempt at a solution was the Peace of God movement, which emerged in southern France in the 990s. Local councils of bishops gathered peasants and knights together and extracted oaths sworn on the relics of saints, The most binding form of promise a medieval person could make to refrain from attacking non-combatants, from raiding church property, from making war during the holy seasons of Advent and Lent. The movement spread rapidly across France and into other kingdoms. It did not stop the violence. But it established something important, the principle that the Church had the authority to direct and constrain the use of force, and that warriors had an obligation to place their swords in the service of something larger than their own appetite. The next step was to give that something larger a specific shape. The idea had been developing for decades, fed by the experience of Christian warriors fighting Muslims in Spain and on the Italian coast, conflicts in which the Church had blessed the fighters and in some cases promised spiritual rewards for those who died. In 847, Pope Leo IV wrote to a Frankish army preparing to fight Arab raiders and told them plainly that any man who died in that war, fighting for the truth of the faith and the defense of Christians, would receive the kingdom of heaven as his reward. It was possibly the first time a pope had explicitly promised paradise to soldiers killed in battle against a religious enemy. The concept of holy war had found its voice. The Reformed papacy of the 11th century took this concept and built an institution around it. The popes who came to power in the decades before the First Crusade, Leo IX, Alexander II, Gregory VII, were not merely administrators. They were ideologues, convinced that the Church had been corrupted by its entanglement with secular power and determined to free it. The great struggle of this period, known as the investiture controversy, was at its core a fight over who had the right to appoint bishops, the pope or the emperor. It was a conflict over the most basic question of political authority in the medieval world, and it consumed the papacy for half a century. Gregory VII, the most radical of the Reformed popes, pushed the confrontation to its limit. He excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, the most powerful ruler in Europe, and told the princes of Germany they were released from their oaths of loyalty to him. Henry responded by marching on Rome and driving Gregory into exile, where the Pope died in 1085, reportedly saying, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." The papacy had claimed the highest possible authority and paid a terrible price for it. The man who came after Gregory, Urban II, inherited both the claim and the damage, and understood that restoring the papacy's prestige required something dramatic. Urban II was a man of unusual political intelligence. He had watched Gregory's confrontational approach produce exile and humiliation. He understood that the papacy's authority rested ultimately on the consent of Christian society, and that consent had to be earned, not simply declared. What he needed was a cause that would unite the fractious warrior class of Europe behind the Church, rather than against it, a project so large, so sacred, and so clearly necessary that even the knights who had spent their careers fighting each other would lay down their local quarrels and march together under the banner of Christ. By 1095, the pieces were in place. The warrior class existed, trained, armed, and hungry for purpose. The ideology of holy war had been developing for 2 centuries, blessed by popes and sanctified by precedent. The papacy had spent 50 years asserting its authority over the whole of Christian society and needed a victory to prove the claim. And from the East came news that made the moment impossible to ignore the letter from Constantinople and the empire that was finally out of options. What Urban II understood, and what the full weight of this history makes clear, is that the First Crusade did not begin at Clermont. It began in the Carolingian collapse, in the Norse raids on Irish monasteries, in the Magyar horsemen crossing into Bavaria, in the Arab fleet sailing up the Tiber. It began the day the feudal warrior class was born, and the Church decided it needed to aim that class at something other than itself. Clermont was not the spark. It was the moment a fire that had been building for 2 centuries finally found its purpose. On the 26th of August, 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led his army into the highlands of eastern Anatolia to confront a Seljuk Turkish force under the Sultan Alp Arslan. What happened that day was not simply a battle. It was the moment the eastern shield of Christendom cracked, and through that crack poured the forces that would, within a generation, make the Crusades not just possible but necessary. The Byzantine Empire that rode out to meet the Seljuks that morning was not what it had once been. Decades of misrule, court intrigue, and deliberate neglect of the military had hollowed out the professional armies that had defended the eastern frontier for centuries. Romanos had inherited an empire in which powerful civilian bureaucrats had systematically starved the army of funding, preferring to keep that money in the imperial treasury and in their own pockets. The force he commanded at Manzikert was a patchwork professional soldiers alongside unreliable mercenaries, eastern levies of uncertain loyalty, and contingents whose commanders owed their positions to politics rather than competence. The battle itself turned on treachery. During the engagement, a key Byzantine commander, Andronikos Doukas, who had his own political reasons to see Romanos fail, withdrew his forces from the field at a critical moment, leaving the emperor's center exposed. Romanos fought with personal courage, but the army around him collapsed. He was captured by Alp Arslan, who treated his prisoner with extraordinary courtesy, rising to meet him, refusing to let him kneel, and negotiating a ransom and a peace treaty, rather than pressing his advantage. By the standards of the age, it was a remarkably civilized conclusion to a decisive battle. What followed, however, was anything but. Romanos was released and began the journey back to Constantinople. He never arrived. The political enemies who had engineered his defeat now had him seized, blinded, and thrown into a monastery, where he died of his wounds within weeks. The peace treaty he had negotiated with Alp Arslan died with him. The new emperor, Michael VII, repudiated it immediately and in doing so, threw away the one thing that might have limited the damage. Alp Arslan's restraint had been real. His successors felt no obligation to honor agreements made with a government that had already dishonored them. What followed Manzikert was not a conquest, it was a flood. With no effective Byzantine military force in the field, and no political authority capable of organizing resistance, Seljuk and Turkmen groups poured into Anatolia almost unopposed. Cities that had been Christian for 1,000 years passed under new rule within a decade. The great agricultural heartland that had fed Constantinople and sustained the empire's tax base shrank year by year. By 1080, the Seljuks controlled approximately 30,000 square miles of what had been Byzantine territory. The Sultanate of Rum, the Sultanate of Rome, they called it, appointed appropriation of the empire's own identity, had established its capital at Nicaea, a city less than 100 miles from Constantinople itself. It was in this moment of extremity that Alexios Komnenos seized power. He came to the throne in 1081 through a military coup, and he was precisely the kind of ruler the empire needed: energetic, calculating, politically brilliant, and utterly clear-eyed about the scale of the problem he had inherited. He spent his first decade stabilizing the empire's finances, rebuilding its army, and fighting off threats on multiple frontiers simultaneously. By 1095, he had stabilized the situation enough to contemplate something he had been considering for years, reaching out to the Christian West for military assistance. It was not a decision made lightly. The Eastern and Western churches had formally broken with each other in 1054, in a schism defined by mutual excommunications, competing claims to theological authority, and decades of accumulated bitterness. The Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople did not consider each other legitimate leaders of the same faith. Alexios, asking Rome for help, was the equivalent of a man calling on an estranged brother he had publicly insulted, necessary, humiliating, and entirely uncertain of outcome. He wrote the letter anyway. In March of 1095, Byzantine envoys appeared before Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza in northern Italy. The message they brought was carefully framed a request for military assistance against the Turks who had seized Byzantine Anatolia, an appeal to Christian brotherhood, and an implicit acknowledgement that the Eastern Empire could not recover its losses alone. What Alexios wanted was professional soldiers he could hire and command, Western knights, serving under Byzantine authority, helping to reclaim Byzantine land. What he got, in the end, was something he had not asked for and could not fully control. Urban II heard the Byzantine appeal with great interest, and not solely because of Christian solidarity. The papacy he led was still recovering from the damage Gregory VII had inflicted on it through the investiture controversy. Gregory had claimed the highest possible authority for the pope, the right to depose emperors, to release subjects from their oaths, to stand above every secular power in Christendom, and had been driven out of Rome and died in exile for it. Urban had spent 7 years carefully rebuilding the papacy's relationships and reputation. What he needed now was not another confrontation but a demonstration proof, on the largest possible stage, that the Pope's leadership of Christendom was real, effective, and capable of achieving things no king or emperor could achieve alone. A holy war to recover the Christian East was exactly that demonstration. It would unite the feudal warrior class behind the Church rather than against it. It would give the knights of Europe a purpose for their violence that the Church could bless and direct. It would assert papal authority over the whole of Christendom in the most visible and dramatic way imaginable. And it would answer, at last, the centuries-long question of what Christian civilization was going to do about the slow erosion of its eastern frontier. Urban spent the months after Piacenza preparing with meticulous care, touring France, meeting privately with key lords, lining up the political support he would need before he made his public announcement. The Council of Clermont was called for November of 1095, and it was primarily, on paper, a meeting about church reform, the kind of administrative council Urban had been conducting throughout his papacy. 300 clergy attended from across France. They debated simony, clerical celibacy, and the excommunication of the King of France for adultery. Then, on the final day of the council, November 27th, Urban stepped outside. The crowd that had gathered was too large for the cathedral. He stood on a wooden platform in an open field and began to speak. No exact transcript of the speech survives. 5 different accounts were written by men who were present or who spoke to those who were, and they agree on the substance if not the precise words. Urban spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians under Turkish rule. He spoke of the holy places Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the inheritance of Christ in the hands of those who did not venerate them. He spoke of the duty of Christian warriors to place their swords in the service of something greater than their own quarrels. And he offered something no pope had ever offered on this scale, a plenary indulgence, the full remission of the spiritual penalties of sin, for every man who took the cross and completed the journey. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. The cry that rose from the field at Clermont Deus Levolt, God wills, it was not a slogan Urban had prepared. It arose spontaneously from the thousands gathered before him, and it tells us something essential about the world in which this speech was delivered. These were not people who needed to be convinced that Jerusalem mattered. They already knew. They had grown up in a world that prayed toward Jerusalem every day, that kept relics from Jerusalem in its churches, that sent its most devoted members on the long and dangerous pilgrimage to Jerusalem as the supreme act of faith. Urban had not created this desire. He had given it a direction. What happened at Clermont was the convergence of 2 crises, the Byzantine Empire's military collapse and the papacy's political need, producing an outcome that neither Alexios nor Urban had fully anticipated. Alexios had asked for mercenaries. Urban had called for a holy war. The knights of Europe had heard something else entirely, a call to recover what Christendom had lost, to place their trained and restless violence in the service of God, and to die, if necessary, with the full assurance that heaven awaited them. These were not the same thing, and the gap between what was asked for and what was unleashed would define the Crusades from the first mile of the march to the last. The response to Clermont was unlike anything Urban II had anticipated. He had expected thousands of knights to answer the call. What came instead was a movement, vast, chaotic, driven by forces the Church had helped create but could not fully control. Before the official Crusade army had taken a single step, before the princes had sold their estates and assembled their retinues, the roads of France and Germany were already thick with people who had heard the word from Clermont and decided, on their own authority, that God was calling them east. The man at the center of this unauthorized surge was a French priest named Peter of Amiens, known to history as Peter the Hermit. Lean, ragged, perpetually on the move, he rode a donkey from town to town across northern France and into the Rhineland, preaching the crusade with a fervor that drew crowds wherever he appeared. He claimed to have personally visited Jerusalem and witnessed the suffering of Christians there. He claimed to carry a letter from Christ himself. Whether any of this was true mattered less than the effect men and women who had never considered themselves warriors knelt in the mud of village squares and took the cross, convinced that God's protection would carry them where military training could not. By the spring of 1096, Peter had gathered a host of somewhere between 20 and 40,000 followers, peasants, minor knights, women, children, elderly pilgrims, and set out for Constantinople months ahead of the official departure date Urban had specified. They had almost no money, almost no provisions, and almost no military capability worth the name. What they had was certainty, and in the medieval world, certainty of divine favor could move people further than any commander's order. It could also, as the people of the Rhineland were about to discover, move them to commit acts that no honest account of the Crusades can leave unexamined. The question that arose in the minds of some among Peter's followers, and more virulently among bands that marched behind other popular preachers, was one of logic as much as hatred. If the purpose of this march was to avenge injuries done to Christ and recover his inheritance, why travel 3,000 miles to find enemies of the faith when enemies of the faith lived in the cities right beside them? The Jews of the Rhine Valley had been present in these cities for generations, merchants, moneylenders, neighbors. They were now, to the inflamed minds of certain crusading bands, an obstacle and an affront. In May of 1096, a count named Emico of Flonheim led a band of crusaders into the Jewish communities of the Rhine cities. At Speyer, the local bishop sheltered the Jewish population and saved most of them. At Worms, the bishop attempted the same, and the Crusaders broke into his palace and carried out the massacre inside it. At Mainz, the largest Jewish community in Germany, over 1,000 people were killed. The communities of Cologne, Trier, and Metz were similarly attacked. In some cities, Jews facing the choice between conversion and death chose a third path, ending their own lives and those of their children rather than surrender their faith. The total dead across the Rhineland massacres of 1096 is estimated at between 5,000 and 10,000 people, perhaps a quarter to a third of the Jewish population of Germany and northern France. Pope Urban condemned the massacres. The bishops who tried to stop them were ignored. The Holy Roman Emperor, hearing of Emico's campaign, ordered the Jews to be protected, and the order arrived too late and carried too little force to matter. This is the first and most important lesson the crusading system delivered. Before a single crusader had crossed the Bosphorus, the institution could call the force into being. It could not determine what the force would do once it believed itself to be acting in God's name. The gap between the Church's intentions and the violence it had unleashed would widen as the decades passed, and the Rhineland massacres of 1096 were its first and most brutal expression. Peter's host, undisciplined and undersupplied, made its way across Hungary and into Byzantine territory, pillaging as it went. Emperor Alexios, who had asked for professional soldiers, received instead a mob that stripped the countryside as it passed and required Byzantine troops to escort it to Constantinople, simply to prevent it from destroying the empire it had come to save. Alexios, alarmed, had the whole host ferried across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as possible. Within weeks, the Seljuk Turks had found them. At the Battle of Civitat in October 1096, the Turkish cavalry destroyed what remained of Peter's army. Most were killed. Some were taken into slavery. A handful survived to join the official crusade when it arrived months later. The People's Crusade was over before it had truly begun. The official crusade the army Urban had actually planned was a different kind of force entirely. It was built around the great princes of Western Christendom, men of wealth and military experience, who had spent their lives commanding armies. They came from different countries, spoke different languages, and carried very different ambitions beneath the shared language of faith. What united them at the surface was the cross sewn onto their cloaks. What drove them, individually, was far more complicated. Raymond IV of Toulouse was the wealthiest and in some ways the most genuinely pious of the princes, a man in his late 50s who had already fought Muslims in Spain, who had spoken privately with Urban before Clermont, and who had decided to spend the remainder of his life in the service of God. He sold or gave away most of his estates before departing. He would not be coming back. For Raymond, the crusade was not an adventure or an opportunity. It was a vocation, and he pursued it with the inflexible conviction of a man who had already settled his accounts with the world. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was a more ambiguous figure. Later mythology would make him the ideal Christian knight, the pure and selfless warrior whose greatest achievement was refusing to wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. The reality was more interesting. A decade before Clermont, Godfrey had participated in the siege of Rome that drove Pope Gregory VII into exile. He had served the papacy's greatest enemy. That he answered the cross with such commitment in 1096 says something about the power of Urban's message, and something also about the political instincts of a man who understood which way the wind had turned. Bohemond of Taranto was the most honest of them all, in the sense that his ambitions were the least disguised. A giant of a man, contemporary accounts describe him as a head taller than the tallest men around him, with a hard quality to his face and a laugh that sounded like a threat. Bohemond was the son of the Norman adventurer Robert Guiscard, who had spent his career carving out a principality in southern Italy by sheer force of will. Bohemond had inherited his father's gifts and his father's appetite. He had already campaigned against the Byzantine Empire, trying to take territory from it. When the crusade was announced, he abandoned a siege he was conducting in southern Italy, cut his cloak into crosses for his men on the spot, and marched east. His reasons were spiritual and practical, in proportions that he alone knew, and he kept his calculations to himself. The princes departed in the late summer and autumn of 1096, each taking a different route toward Constantinople. Godfrey led his Lorrainian and German force overland through Hungary. Raymond led his southern French army through the mountains of Croatia, and along the Adriatic coast a brutal march through hostile terrain that cost him knights he could not replace. Bohemond sailed from the Italian coast with his Norman force and crossed the Adriatic. The northern French contingent under Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois followed the coastal roads of Italy. 4 great armies converging on a single point, carrying between them perhaps 70 to 80,000. Men, knights, foot soldiers, servants, priests, camp followers, and the irrepressible pilgrims who had attached themselves to every column regardless of anyone's wishes. Emperor Alexios watched them approach with a feeling that contemporary sources describe quite precisely as dread. He had asked for soldiers, he was receiving armies. Armies with their own commanders, their own political agendas, and no particular obligation to do what the Byzantine emperor told them. He had set in motion something he did not control, and the question of what these men would do once they had served their immediate purpose, whether they would hand conquered territory back to Byzantium, as he had asked them to swear, or whether they would keep it for themselves, was one he could not yet answer. It would define the relationship between the Crusaders and their Byzantine hosts for the entirety of the campaign that followed. One by one, the princes arrived at Constantinople through the winter of 1096 and into the spring of 1097. One by one, Alexios received them, feasted them, showed them the incomprehensible wealth of his capital, and pressed them to swear oaths of loyalty to return to Byzantine rule any lands they recovered that had previously belonged to the empire. Most swore. Some swore reluctantly. Raymond refused to swear at all, offering instead a more limited oath not to harm Byzantine interests. Bohemond swore with every appearance of sincerity and the strong private intention of honoring his oath precisely as long as it served him. The alliance between Crusaders and Byzantines was built on mutual need, mutual suspicion, and a shared understanding that the oaths being exchanged were instruments of politics, not bonds of trust. By the spring of 1097, the Crusader armies had crossed the Bosphorus and were assembling in Anatolia. Before them lay the ancient city of Nicaea, the first objective, the gateway to the long road east and beyond it, hundreds of miles of hostile territory between them and Jerusalem. The men who had knelt in French meadows and German town squares a year earlier and sworn to recover the Holy Land were about to find out what that oath actually cost. Most of them had no idea. The knights who rode out of Constantinople that spring had been told that God willed their victory. They had been promised paradise if they died. They had been given no reliable maps, no dependable supply lines, and no clear intelligence about the forces that would meet them. They carried their faith like armor, and in the months ahead they would discover whether faith alone could get them through what was coming. The answer would be more complicated, more costly, and more extraordinary than anyone in that army could have imagined when they first heard the cry go up at Clermont and felt the world shift beneath their feet. The first city the Crusaders encountered was Nicaea, the ancient seat of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, sitting less than 100 miles from Constantinople itself, on the eastern shore of a lake that its defenders could use to receive supplies as long as it remained open. The city had once been the most important theological gathering point in Christian history, the site of the Council of Nicaea in 325, where the fundamental creed of Christian faith had been hammered out. It was now a Muslim fortress. The Crusaders arrived before its walls in May of 1097 and settled in for a siege. Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, had initially dismissed the Crusaders as another mob like the People's Crusade that had been destroyed the previous autumn. He had left Nicaea to campaign on his eastern frontier, taking his treasury with him. When word reached him that this new army was far more formidable than the last, he returned at speed and launched an assault on the Christian lines on the 21st of May. The assault was repulsed. Kilij Arslan regrouped and struck again. It was repulsed again. Unable to break through and unable to resupply the city by land, the Sultan withdrew to consolidate his forces for a future engagement, abandoning his garrison to its fate. The fate the garrison chose was surrender, but not to the Crusaders. Emperor Alexios, whose ships controlled the lake, had been negotiating privately with the defenders, and on the 18th of June, the city quietly surrendered to Byzantine agents. The Crusaders woke to find Byzantine banners flying over Nicaea's walls. They were not permitted to enter and claim the plunder they had earned through weeks of siege work. Alexios distributed gifts to the princes to soften the blow and praised their efforts in carefully diplomatic language. His own agenda was clear. Nicaea was a Byzantine city recovered for the Byzantine Empire, and the Crusaders' role in its recovery was useful, but not decisive. The distrust between the two allies, present from the moment the first oath was sworn at Constantinople, hardened overnight. The army marched east on the 26th of June, dividing into two columns to manage the supply problem across the empty Anatolian plateau. The vanguard, under Bohemond, Tancred, and Robert of Normandy, moved a day ahead of the main body, under Godfrey, Raymond, and Hugh of Vermandois. Kilij Arslan had been watching, and he had chosen his ground carefully. On the morning of the 1st of July, near the ruined Byzantine town of Dorylaeum, the Turkish cavalry swept down on Bohemond's vanguard from the hills and attacked with the tactics that had been terrifying Byzantine armies. For a generation, fast-moving horse archers who swept in, loosed their arrows, and retreated before the heavy Frankish cavalry could close with them. Bohemon's response in those first chaotic hours showed why he was the most formidable military commander in the crusading army. Rather than attempting a charge he could not sustain, he ordered his knights to dismount and fight alongside the infantry in a tight defensive formation, forming a wall of men and shields that denied the Turks easy targets while protecting the horses and the non-combatants sheltered within the camp. For hours, in the brutal July heat of the Anatolian plateau, the formation held. Women in the camp carried water to the men on the line. The Turks could not break through. And then, in the early afternoon, the main Crusader army arrived from behind the Turkish position. Godfrey and Raymond led cavalry charges that shattered the Turkish forces, sending Kilij Arslan into full retreat and leaving behind an enormous camp filled with gold, silk, horses, and weapons. The Battle of Dorylaeum broke Seljuk confidence in their ability to stop the crusade through a single decisive engagement. Kilij Arslan abandoned the tactic of direct confrontation and instead adopted a scorched earth strategy, burning crops, poisoning water sources, and stripping the land ahead of the Crusader advance to starve them into submission. What followed was one of the most punishing marches in medieval military history. The Crusaders crossed the vast, sun-baked Anatolian plateau through the height of summer with inadequate water, dwindling food, and an enemy who refused to face them in open battle, but was always present at the edges of their column. Men died of thirst and heat exhaustion on the march. Horses died in numbers the army could not afford, forcing knights, men who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat, to walk beside their dead animals or ride oxen. By the time the Crusaders descended from the plateau into the greener lands of Cilicia and northern Syria in the late autumn of 1097, they had lost perhaps a third of the men who had crossed the Bosphorus the previous spring. They were lean, hardened, and still moving. On the 20th of October, 1097, the lead columns reached the walls of Antioch. Antioch was not a city that could be taken by storm. Its walls stretched for 12 miles around the city and up into the steep slopes of Mount Silpius, studded with 400 towers, built on terrain that made a full encirclement impossible. The garrison, under the Turkish governor Yagi Siyan, was well supplied, well organized, and fully aware that help was coming. The city had dominated the northern Syrian landscape since the days of Alexander the Great, and it had never fallen to a direct assault. The Crusaders set up camp before its northern gates, blockaded what they could reach, and prepared for a siege whose length none of them could have predicted. The winter that followed was a sustained ordeal. Food ran short within weeks as foraging parties ranged further and further from the city and returned with less and less. The cold was severe. Disease moved through the camp. Men who had marched from France and Germany and Italy with the conviction that God would provide found themselves eating bark and leather, and, in the worst weeks, the flesh of horses that had died of exhaustion. Desertion became a serious problem. Even Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest lords in the Crusader army, abandoned the siege in early 1098 and sailed home, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and eventually drive him to return to the east to salvage his honor. Through the winter and into the spring, Bohemond was building something invisible. He had been patrolling the walls of Antioch on horseback, night after night, studying the garrison rotations, identifying the guards, and gradually making contact with one of them, a man named Firuz, an Armenian Christian who had converted to Islam and commanded the Tower of the Two Sisters. Firuz had a grievance against the governor. The nature of the grievance is unclear. The sources suggest money or insult or something more personal, but Bohemond cultivated it carefully over months, turning a resentful soldier into a willing conspirator. By the spring of 1098, Firuz had agreed to open his tower at night for a price and for the promise of a title. Bohemond brought this information to the Council of Princes, but he attached a condition. If he could deliver Antioch, Antioch would be his in direct contravention of the oath sworn to Alexios at Constantinople. Raymond of Toulouse was furious and argued that the city must be returned to Byzantium. The other princes, who had watched Bohemond carry the army through every crisis it had faced over the previous year, overruled him. On the night of the 2nd of June, 1098, a Crusader force staged an elaborate feint marching south as if departing for a foraging expedition, and then doubling back under cover of darkness to the base of Firuz's tower. Ladders went up. Men climbed in silence. Firuz opened the gate. Within hours, the Crusaders held most of Antioch's walls, and by morning, the city was theirs. 5 days later, Kerboga of Mosul arrived with a relief army estimated at between 35 and 40,000 men, larger than the entire Crusader force, and laid siege to the besiegers. The men who had just endured 8 months of starvation to take Antioch now found themselves trapped inside it, facing the same fate they had just inflicted on its previous garrison. Kerbogha refused the Crusaders' request to be allowed to leave peacefully. The full Muslim relief army surrounded the city. Inside the walls, the situation was desperate. Horses were being slaughtered for food. Men were dying of starvation at a rate the army could not sustain. Deserters slipped down the walls at night on ropes and fled to the coast. It was in this moment of absolute extremity that a southern French peasant named Peter Bartholomew came before Count Raymond and reported a vision. St. Andrew had appeared to him, he said, and revealed that beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral of St. Peter lay the Holy Lance, the lance that had pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. If the Crusaders found it and carried it into battle, God would grant them victory. The army's spiritual leader, Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, was privately skeptical. Several of the princes considered it absurd, but Raymond believed, and in an army that was starving and running out of reasons to stay, belief was a military asset. An excavation was ordered. On the 14th of June, after hours of digging beneath the cathedral floor with the assembled army watching, Peter Bartholomew himself descended into the pit and emerged holding a rusted iron object, crying out that the lance had been found. Whether what Peter pulled from the ground in Antioch was the actual lance of the crucifixion, a planted prop, or a genuine ancient artifact whose provenance no one could verify, the effect on the men who witnessed it was the same. The eyewitness chronicle of Raymond of Aguilar's records that the discovery caused grown men to weep, to fall to their knees, to embrace strangers. In a starving army that had spent 8 months marching toward what increasingly looked like death, the lance was exactly what the moment required, not proof of divine favor, but the feeling of it, which, in the psychology of that world, was more powerful than proof. On the 28th of June, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch's gates to face Kerbogha's army in open battle. They were gaunt, undersupplied, and vastly outnumbered. They carried the lance at the front of the column. Kerbogha, watching them emerge, made a fatal miscalculation. He chose to allow the entire Crusader force to deploy outside the city before attacking, hoping to destroy them completely in a single engagement, rather than cut them down piecemeal as they came through the gates. The decision gave Bohemond time to arrange his divisions and deliver a series of coordinated cavalry charges that struck the Muslim coalition at its weakest points. Kerbogha's vast army, composed of contingents from rival Muslim factions who trusted each other poorly, broke under the pressure faster than anyone had expected. The coalition shattered. Kerbogha fled. Antioch was secure. The army rested for 6 months in Antioch, too weakened and too politically divided to march immediately. Bohemond claimed his prize and refused to leave. Raymond, who believed the city belonged to Byzantium, refused to endorse the claim. Alexios, who had learned of the Crusaders' situation at Antioch through the treacherous Stephen of Blois, had turned his army around and never come. The oath sworn at Constantinople was now effectively dead. The Crusaders were on their own, in the middle of Syria, holding a city that belonged to no one's plan and everything to Bohemond's ambition, arguing about obligations to an emperor who had abandoned them when they needed him most. It was the common soldiers who broke the deadlock. The ordinary men of the army, the knights and foot soldiers and pilgrims who had not come to Syria to administer a city, but to reach Jerusalem, began pressing their leaders with increasing urgency. Promises had been made. Vows had been sworn. Jerusalem was still 500 miles away. In January of 1099, Raymond of Toulouse settled his quarrel with Bohemond as best he could and departed Antioch barefoot, carrying a pilgrim's staff. In a gesture that announced to everyone watching that the crusade was resuming its true purpose, the army fell in behind him. Bohemond stayed in Antioch. The road to Jerusalem was open at last. What lay ahead of them in the spring and summer of 1099 was the final passage south through Syria along the coast, past the great Muslim port cities whose rulers, exhausted by their own conflicts, chose to buy peace with food and provisions rather than fight. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt held Jerusalem, and they had watched the Crusades' progress with their own complex interests, enemies of the Seljuk Turks, initially willing to negotiate, ultimately unable to comprehend that the army approaching from the north would settle for nothing less than the city itself. On the 7th of June, 1099, the Crusaders climbed the hill known as Mount Joy, and Jerusalem appeared before them on the horizon. The men who had left France 3 years earlier, who had buried half their number in the dust of Anatolia and the mud of Antioch, stopped in their tracks and wept. Some of them had been walking toward this moment since they were young. Some had promised dying friends they would complete the journey for them. Some had no one left to go back to and understood, clearly and without sentimentality, that this city was now the only destination their life contained. The walls before them were high. The garrison was strong. The Fatimid governor had expelled Jerusalem's Christian population to prevent betrayal. The summer sun was already brutal. None of it mattered to the men standing on that hill, looking at the skyline of the city they had crossed a continent to reach. They had been promised by their faith, by their pope, and by the logic of the world they had been born into, that God willed them to be here. They were here. What happened next would determine whether everything they had paid was worth the price. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 5 weeks. The assault came on the 14th and 15th of July, 1099, a coordinated attack on multiple sections of the wall, using siege towers laboriously constructed from timber that had arrived by ship at the port of Jaffa. Godfrey of Bouillon's tower was brought up against the northeastern wall in the early hours of July 15th. 2 of his knights were the first to cross onto the ramparts. Godfrey followed. The gate was opened. The army poured through. The Fatimid garrison, outnumbered and outfought, broke and ran, and by midday Jerusalem was in Christian hands for the first time in 461 years. The city the Crusaders entered on the 15th of July, 1099, was not the Jerusalem of their imagination. The Jerusalem of their imagination was a gleaming holy city, eternal and unchanging, preserved by God for the day of its restoration. The Jerusalem they actually entered was a walled medieval city of perhaps 30,000 people, its streets narrow and dusty, its buildings a layered accretion of Roman, Byzantine, and Arab construction, its sacred sites intermingled with markets, stables, and the ordinary refuse of urban life. They had marched 3 years for it. They wept when they saw it from the hill. And then the killing began. What happened in Jerusalem in the hours and days after the walls were breached is one of the most contested questions in the history of the Crusades. The popular account that the Crusaders massacred every inhabitant, that the streets ran with blood up to the horses' bridles, that no one was spared, is drawn from a handful of medieval sources. Some of them written decades after the event, some of them at a considerable distance from Jerusalem, and at least one of which is openly propagandistic. Modern historians, including Connor Kostick and others who have examined the primary sources carefully, have consistently found the most extreme figures implausible. The city's population on the day of the assault was almost certainly between 20 and 30,000, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside. The number killed was significant and terrible. The imagery of blood running to the horses' bridles was a biblical metaphor drawn from the Book of Revelation, not a literal measurement. What the primary sources, including eyewitness Christian chronicles, early Arabic accounts from Egypt and Syria, and the administrative records of the new government do establish is this: there was widespread and brutal killing in the first hours, and days after the city fell, concentrated particularly on the Temple Mount, where the Muslim garrison made its final stand. Many inhabitants were killed. Many others were expelled or ransomed. The Fatimid governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla surrendered the Tower of David to Raymond of Toulouse and was given safe passage out of the city, a protection Raymond honored. The evidence suggests a pattern more consistent with the brutal norms of medieval siege warfare, which were brutal enough, than with the image of total extermination that later centuries attached to the event. The killing was real. The suffering of those who lived through it was real. The fact that the most extreme accounts are probably exaggerated does not diminish what happened. It simply makes the historical reality more legible and the moral weight more precise. What the Crusaders did at Jerusalem in July of 1099 was what armies throughout the medieval world did to cities taken by storm after a siege. They killed, they looted, they claimed their prize. The shock in the Muslim world was not that such things had happened, they had happened before, at the hands of Muslim armies as well as Christian ones, but that they had happened in Jerusalem, and that the army which did them had no intention of leaving. 3 weeks after the fall of the city, a Fatimid relief army under the Vizier al-Afdal arrived from Egypt at the port of Ascalon, intent on reversing the conquest. The Crusaders, still flushed with victory and operating with the decisive speed that had defined their best moments, marched south to meet them before they could reach Jerusalem. On the 12th of August, the Frankish cavalry charges shattered the Fatimid formations on the plain outside Ascalon. Al-Afdal retreated to Egypt. Jerusalem was secure. Pope Urban II, the man who had set all of this in motion at Clermont 4 years earlier, had died 2 weeks before the city fell on the 29th of July, 1099, without knowing that his great project had succeeded. The question of who would govern the new Christian state was settled on the 22nd of July, before the Fatimid threat had even been defeated. The princes assembled in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to choose a ruler. Raymond of Toulouse, the wealthiest and most senior of the surviving princes, was offered the position first. He declined, whether from genuine piety or political calculation, is debated, saying that he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Godfrey of Bouillon accepted the position but refused the royal title for the same reason. He took instead the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, the protector, not the king, of Jerusalem. It was a distinction that mattered enormously in the theology of the moment and not very much in the practical exercise of power. Godfrey held the city for barely a year before dying of illness in July 1100. His brother Baldwin, who had spent the previous 2 years carving out the county of Edessa in northern Mesopotamia, came south and was crowned the first king of Jerusalem on Christmas Day 1100. Without ceremony or apology about the crown, Baldwin I was everything. His brother had been in military competence and considerably more in political ruthlessness. Over the next decade, he systematically conquered the coastal cities that the kingdom needed to maintain contact with the West Acre in 1104, Beirut and Sidon in 1110. Ascalon remained out of reach until 1153, building the infrastructure of a state that was viable rather than merely symbolic. What the Crusaders built in the Levant between 1099 and the middle of the 12th century was not a simple military occupation. It was a transplanted medieval European society, adapted under enormous pressure to an environment that was nothing like the one it had come from. The feudal structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem mirrored that of France and the other Latin kingdoms: lords, vassals, knights, clergy, and the complex web of obligation that held them together, but the world it operated in demanded constant improvisation. There were never enough Frankish settlers to replace the indigenous population. There were never enough knights to garrison every castle and defend every frontier. The kingdom survived its first century, not because it was strong, but because its enemies were divided. The Muslim world's initial response to the Crusader states was, in several respects, as revealing as the Crusaders' behavior itself. The first Arabic accounts of the fall of Jerusalem, written in Egypt and Syria in the years immediately after, treated as a significant but not catastrophic event, one defeat among many in a landscape of constant conflict between rival Muslim rulers. It was not until Nur ad-Din and Saladin, 2 generations later, that a unified Islamic counter-narrative emerged in which the Crusaders were cast as the primary enemy, and the recovery of Jerusalem became the central project of Muslim political life. The rage that later generations attributed to the Muslim world in 1099 was, in significant part, a retrospective construction, a product of the jihad ideology that developed in response to the Crusaders' continued presence rather than an immediate reaction to their arrival. The practical reality of life in the Crusader states was complex in ways that neither side's propaganda acknowledged. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was not a community of Latin Christians living in splendid isolation from the indigenous population. It was a multilingual, multi-religious society in which Greek, Armenian, and Syrian Christians occupied significant roles in commerce, administration, and the military. Muslim merchants traded in Crusader ports. Muslim and Christian lords sometimes cooperated against common enemies. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem, became masters of the diplomatic art, negotiating truces, managing tribute payments, and maintaining working relationships with Muslim neighbors that the ideology of holy war would never have sanctioned in theory, but that the reality of governing a small state in a hostile region made absolutely necessary. It is this reality, messy, pragmatic, human, that makes the Crusader states so interesting as a historical subject, and so poorly served by both their defenders and their critics. The defenders want a story of Christian heroism and righteous reconquest. The critics want a story of colonial brutality and religious violence. Both stories are true in part. Neither story captures what actually happened when the men who had left France and Germany and Italy 3 years earlier settled down in the eastern Mediterranean and began the ordinary work of building institutions, raising children, learning Arabic, and figuring out how to keep their kingdom alive from one generation to the next. What they built lasted, in various forms, for nearly 2 centuries. The county of Edessa survived until 1144. The Principality of Antioch survived until 1268. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, in its various configurations, lasted until 1291. These were not temporary military camps. They were functioning political entities with courts, laws, currencies, and dynasties. They were also perpetually vulnerable, cut off from Europe by months of sea travel, surrounded by enemies who gradually unified against them, dependent on a trickle of new settlers and a periodic influx of Crusaders who arrived, fought, and returned home, leaving the resident population to manage the consequences. The First Crusade had achieved something that most of the men who answered Urban's call at Clermont had probably not genuinely believed was possible. They had marched from the cities of France and Germany to the walls of Jerusalem and taken the city. They had done it without Byzantine support, without a reliable supply chain, without modern communications, and without losing their collective will through 2 years of the most brutal conditions a medieval army could face. Whatever else one says about it, and there is much else to say, the achievement was extraordinary, and the men who accomplished it knew it. The chaplain of Raymond of Toulouse, writing from Jerusalem in the aftermath of the victory, described the army's entry into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in language that makes clear he believed he was witnessing something that had never happened before and would never happen again. He was wrong about the second part. The system that had produced the First Crusade was still in operation, still generating warriors, still issuing papal indulgences, still feeding the conviction that the Holy Land was a Christian inheritance that could not be abandoned. When Jerusalem came under threat again, 45 years later, the same mechanisms would activate, the same language would be deployed, and the same question would be asked whether the faith and the force that had taken the city the first time could be summoned again to hold it. The answer to that question was far more complicated and far more costly than anyone in the jubilant army gathered at the Holy Sepulchre in July of 1099 could have imagined. For the first 4 decades after the fall of Jerusalem, the Crusader states survived through a combination of military competence, political fortune, and the profound disunity of the Muslim world around them. The emirs of Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul spent as much energy fighting each other as they did fighting the Franks. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt was Shia, the Seljuk Turks were Sunni, and the theological gulf between them ran far deeper than any shared hostility to the Christian presence in Palestine. The Crusaders understood this and exploited it, making alliances with Muslim states against other Muslim states, negotiating tribute payments, maintaining trade relationships, and generally behaving like the regional power they had become rather than the holy warriors their ideology insisted they were. This equilibrium was disrupted on the 24th of December, 1144, when Zengi, the Turkish Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, laid siege to the city of Edessa, the oldest of the Crusader states, founded in 1098 by Baldwin of Boulogne in the opening weeks of the First Crusade. The city's garrison was depleted. Count Jocelyn II had marched most of his troops away to support an allied operation elsewhere. When Zengi's sappers undermined a section of wall and it collapsed, the city fell within hours. Zengi killed the Frankish population and enslaved the rest. The First Crusader state was gone, and the news, when it reached Europe in the spring of 1145, struck with the force of a theological crisis. If the First Crusade had been God's work, if the capture of Jerusalem had been divine confirmation that the enterprise was blessed, then what did the fall of Edessa mean? The answer that Bernard of Clairvaux offered in sermons that drew crowds of thousands, in letters that commanded kings, in a preaching campaign of extraordinary reach and emotional intensity, was that it meant nothing about the validity of the crusade and everything about the sinfulness of the men conducting it. God had not abandoned the cause. He had withdrawn his favor from an unworthy generation. The Second Crusade was an opportunity to repent, to purify, to earn back the divine support that Edessa's loss proved had been squandered. Bernard was not merely the most influential churchman in Europe, he was something rarer than that. He was a man whose personal holiness was so widely credited that contemporaries attributed miracles to his presence, and whose rhetorical gifts were of a kind that does not appear in every generation. When he preached at Vézelay on Easter Day, 1146, before King Louis VII of France and the flower of the French nobility, so many men took the cross that Bernard reportedly tore his own habit into strips to make more crosses for the volunteers. When he preached to Conrad III of Germany at Christmas Mass in Speyer Cathedral, he framed the appeal as a direct address from Christ himself, asking the emperor to account for all the gifts God had given him, and then asking what more God should have done. Conrad, a large man not given to public displays of emotion, wept openly and took the cross on the spot. The army that assembled for the Second Crusade was, on paper, the most impressive the crusading movement had ever produced. It was led not by ambitious princes and minor dukes, but by two of the greatest rulers in Christendom, the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. It had papal backing, theological authority, and the momentum of Bernard's extraordinary preaching behind it. It also had the same structural problems that would plague every major crusade divided command: poor logistics, Byzantine mistrust, and the fundamental difficulty of moving large armies across thousands of miles of hostile terrain without a reliable supply chain. Conrad's German army went first, crossing into Anatolia in the autumn of 1147 and marching inland toward Dorylaeum, the same ground where Bohemond had held off the Seljuks 50 years earlier. The comparison was not favorable. Conrad's force was ambushed by the Seljuk Sultan Masud near Dorylaeum and routed. The German army lost a substantial portion of its strength in a single engagement, and Conrad himself, wounded and shaken, limped back to Byzantine territory. Louis VII and the French fared only marginally better, harassed across Anatolia by Turkish cavalry, bled by desertion, and finally broken at the crossing of Mount Cadmus when the army's discipline collapsed under a sudden attack. By the time the French remnant arrived at Antioch in the spring of 1148, it was a fraction of what had left France the previous year. The political decision that followed was the Second Crusade's defining failure. The army's original objective, the recovery of Edessa, was no longer feasible. Nur ad-Din, Zengi's son and successor, had razed the city to the ground after his father's assassination, eliminating any possibility of a viable Crusader population to defend it. The Crusades' leaders assembled at Acre in June 1148 to decide their next move. They chose Damascus, a city that had been an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for years, a Muslim state that had cooperated with the Franks against the common threat of the Zengids. A city whose fall would remove the last buffer between the Crusader states and Nur ad-Din's growing empire. It was, by any strategic analysis, a choice that served the Crusades' enemies more than its own interests. The siege of Damascus lasted 4 days. The Crusaders initially occupied orchards that provided both cover and water, an excellent position. Then, under circumstances that contemporary sources struggle to explain, but that probably involved a combination of panic, poor coordination, and the approach of a Zengid relief army, the Christian forces abandoned their position and moved to a section of the city's perimeter that was fully exposed and had no water. Within hours, the situation was untenable. The Crusaders withdrew. Damascus survived. Nur ad-Din inherited a grateful city whose population now understood that the only protection against the Franks lay in unification with the Zengid north. The Second Crusade had, in 4 days before the walls of Damascus, achieved the opposite of its strategic purpose. Bernard of Clairvaux, whose credibility was now staked on the outcome, spent his final years defending the Crusades' failure in theological rather than military terms. God had not been defeated, he insisted. The people had been tested and found wanting. Sin explained the outcome. This framework, that crusading failure was always a consequence of Christian unworthiness, rather than military or strategic incompetence, would become central to crusading ideology for the next century. And it had a deeply pernicious practical effect. It meant that the lesson drawn from every defeat was not that the strategy was wrong, but that the warriors were insufficiently pure. The response to failure was not reform, but more fervent commitment to the same methods. The system had built in a mechanism for perpetuating itself regardless of results. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, the dynamics were shifting in ways that would eventually render all of this irrelevant. Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, was a different kind of ruler from his father, more ideological, more patient, more genuinely committed to the concept of holy war as a political project, rather than simply a pretext for territorial expansion. He invested in the propaganda of jihad, commissioning pulpits for the Mosque of Jerusalem that he intended to install once the city was recovered, building a popular religious culture around the idea of Muslim unity against the Frankish presence. He never recovered Jerusalem himself, but he built the institutional and ideological infrastructure that made recovery possible, and when he died in 1174, he left that infrastructure to a man who would use it with extraordinary skill. Saladin was born around 1137 in Tikrit, in what is today northern Iraq, the son of a Kurdish officer in the service of the Zengid dynasty. He grew up in proximity to Nur ad-Din's court, absorbing its values and its ambitions. His career began in the conventional way: military service under his uncle Shirkuh, campaigns in Egypt on behalf of the Zengid Empire, the gradual accumulation of military experience and political credit. What elevated him was not a single dramatic act, but a series of shrewd decisions made in circumstances of extraordinary complexity. The ability to identify the moment when loyalty to a superior had become a constraint rather than an advantage, and to move at precisely that moment. In 1169, following his uncle's death, Saladin became vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, a Sunni Kurdish general running the government of a Shia Arab state on behalf of a Sunni Turkish prince who was technically his sovereign. Within 2 years, he had abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, restored Sunni authority in Cairo, and begun redirecting Egypt's enormous agricultural wealth toward military expansion. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved swiftly into Syria, claiming the regency on behalf of Nur ad-Din's young son, and then, when that pretext had served its purpose, setting it aside. By 1176, he had broken the last serious opposition within the Muslim coalition. By 1183, he had taken Aleppo. The unification of Egypt and Syria under a single ruler, the strategic nightmare the Crusader states had spent 80 years preventing, was complete. The most important thing to understand about Saladin is what he spent most of his military career doing. He did not spend it fighting Crusaders. He spent it fighting other Muslims. The siege of Alexandria, the campaign against the Fatimids, the wars against the Zengid princes of Syria, the suppression of internal rebellions, the negotiation and breaking of alliances across a fractured political landscape, this was the work of his career. The Crusaders were the external enemy that provided the ideological justification for everything he did internally. They were the threat he pointed to when he needed Muslim unity. They were the horizon he kept before his coalition to prevent it from breaking apart along the fault lines of sectarian rivalry and personal ambition. Jerusalem, for Saladin, was not just a holy city. It was the political instrument that had made his empire possible. By 1187, Saladin was ready, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem had, through a decade of internal political crisis, done much of his work for him. The kingdom's nobility was divided between factions supporting the regent Raymond of Tripoli and those backing the new king, Guy of Lusignan, a man widely considered to lack the judgment and experience the position required. Into this volatile situation stepped Reynold of Chatillon, the Lord of Ultrajourdain, a man whose relationship with the concept of diplomatic restraint was, to say the least, theoretical. Reynold had spent his career in the Holy Land, accumulating enemies, the Byzantine emperor, the various Muslim rulers whose territory he raided, and Saladin himself, with whom he had broken multiple truces. In 1187, with a peace treaty still nominally in force, Reynold's forces attacked a Muslim caravan traveling north from Cairo merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers under the treaty's protection. Saladin, when he received the news, made a public vow to kill Reynold with his own hands. On the 4th of July, 1187, at a double volcanic hill near the village of Hattin above the Sea of Galilee, Saladin trapped the entire field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and destroyed it. The Crusaders had marched through the summer heat of the Galilean hills without water, toward a position Saladin had chosen with surgical precision, and they arrived exhausted, parched, and already fighting the kind of internal disputes between commanders that had characterized the kingdom's politics for years. The battle lasted through the morning. By afternoon it was over. King Guy was captured. Reynold of Chatillon was brought before Saladin, who fulfilled his vow personally. The true cross, the most sacred relic in the Crusader kingdom, was taken. Nearly every knight and noble of the kingdom was either dead or in chains. What followed Hattin was swift and almost total. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, city after city fell to Saladin's forces in the weeks after the battle, most of them surrendering without a fight because there was nothing left to fight with. On the 2nd of October, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. He entered the city in a manner that contrasted deliberately and pointedly with the events of July 1199. No massacre, no expulsion. A ransom system that allowed most of the Christian population to leave with their lives, the city's churches protected, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre left open to Christian pilgrims. Saladin understood the propaganda value of mercy as clearly as he understood the military value of siegecraft. Jerusalem had been in Christian hands for 88 years. The news reached Europe within weeks. Pope Gregory VIII issued a crusade bull Audita Tremendi, a document of extraordinary grief and anger declaring that Jerusalem's fall was a punishment for Christian sins and calling on the rulers of Europe to take the cross. 3 of them answered, and of the 3, the one who would define the Third Crusade, who would come closer than any other leader since the First Crusade to taking Jerusalem back, was a 32-year-old king of England who had been preparing for war. In the Holy Land since the moment he heard that Hattin had been lost. His name was Richard, and what he was about to attempt had never been tried quite the same way before. Not a crusade of penitential pilgrims seeking divine favor through suffering, but a precisely organized military operation commanded by a man who had studied the failures of every previous crusade and was determined not to repeat them. Whether that was enough to undo what Hattin had done is one of the great questions of medieval history. The answer is complicated and honest, and more interesting than either side of the argument usually admits. 3 rulers answered the call of Audita Tremendi, the papal bull issued after Hattin. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, was nearly 70 years old, had participated in the Second Crusade as a young man, and carried the memory of that disaster as a lesson he had spent decades preparing to act on. When he finally marched east in May of 1189, he did so with the most disciplined and methodically organized crusading army that had ever left Europe, a force whose logistical planning, march discipline, and tactical coherence bore no resemblance to the shambling hosts that had stumbled across Anatolia before him. The Byzantine emperor, Isaac Angelus, had made a secret treaty with Saladin and did everything in his power to obstruct Frederick's march through Byzantine territory, withdrawing markets, ambushing supply parties, and providing intelligence to his Muslim ally. Frederick responded by capturing the Byzantine city of Adrianople and holding it until Isaac agreed to provide transport across the Hellespont. In May of 1190, Frederick's army crushed the Seljuk Turks at Iconium, their capital, in open battle, and the Sultan submitted, providing hostages and supplies. It was the most comprehensive Christian military performance in Anatolia since the First Crusade. Frederick had done in weeks what 2 previous crusades had failed to do. Then, on the 10th of June, while crossing a river in Cilicia on the edge of Christian Armenia, he drowned. The cause: a fall from his horse, a heart attack, a stroke while swimming, the sources cannot agree. What is certain is that the most formidable military commander of the Third Crusade died before reaching the Holy Land, and most of his army went home. The 2 remaining rulers were nothing like each other. Philip II of France was slight, calculating, and cold, a man who had come on crusade because political pressure left him no choice, and whose primary interest throughout was the opportunity it created to undermine Richard's position in France while Richard was absent. Richard I of England was everything Philip was not: tall, red-haired, physically imposing, a poet and musician who had also spent his entire adult life at war, a commander whose instinct for terrain, logistics, and the psychology of battle was matched by a willingness to put himself at the front of any action he ordered. He had been preparing for this crusade since before he was king. He sold everything he could lay his hands on to fund it. He told one of his counselors that he would have sold London if he could find a buyer. Richard's passage through the Mediterranean before reaching the Holy Land produced the most strategically significant event of the entire Third Crusade, even though it happened before a single engagement had been fought. A storm scattered his fleet near Cyprus, and several of his ships, including the vessel carrying his sister Joan and his fiancée Berengaria of Navarre, were forced ashore by the island's self-proclaimed ruler, Isaac Komnenos, who seized the passengers and their valuables. Richard arrived days later, assessed the situation, and proceeded to conquer Cyprus in 10 days, not as a sideshow, but as a deliberate act of strategic intelligence. Cyprus, sitting off the Syrian coast, was the perfect supply base for any army operating in the Holy Land. Richard understood instantly what possession of the island would mean for every campaign that followed. He was right. Cyprus remained a Christian possession for 4 centuries. Richard reached Acre on the 8th of June, 1191, and found a 2-year siege that had ground to a stalemate. Guy of Lusignan's army had been besieging the city since 1189, a remarkable act of defiance from a king who had just lost everything at Hatton, but without the resources to break Acre's walls, fully blockade its harbor. Philip of France had arrived weeks earlier and achieved little. Richard arrived with ships, siege, machinery, supplies, and the kind of organizational energy that transformed every operation he touched. Within a month, Acre surrendered. The Crusaders had their first major city back, and with it the best port in Palestine. What followed the fall of Acre was the action that has most consistently been used to condemn Richard in the centuries since, and which requires the most careful assessment. Saladin had agreed, as the terms of Acre's surrender, to pay a ransom of 200,000 dinars, release over 1,000 Christian prisoners, and return the true cross. He made the first payment late. He missed the second deadline entirely, offering explanations that Richard's envoys found unconvincing. On the 20th of August, 1191, after the third deadline had passed, Richard marched the Muslim garrison, approximately 2,700 men, outside the walls of Acre and had them executed in full view of Saladin's watching army. It was an act of brutal deliberateness. It was also, in the military context of the campaign, a decision made by a commander who could not feed, guard, or transport several thousand prisoners on a march south, and whose opponent had demonstrated repeatedly, with specific deadlines, that he did not intend to honor the agreement that would have saved their lives. Saladin's own biographers record that the Sultan had already calculated his prisoners as a delay tactic. Richard had called the calculation. The march from Acre to Jaffa, which began in late August of 1191, is one of the most remarkable sustained military operations of the medieval era. Richard knew the lesson of Hatton that the greatest danger to a crusading army was not the enemy in front, but heat, thirst, and disorder within. He organized his column with a precision that had no precedent in crusading history. Infantry on the flanks in rotating shield walls, crossbowmen behind them, cavalry in the protected center. The fleet offshore providing supplies and protecting the right flank. For 3 weeks, Saladin's cavalry harassed the column from inland, launching waves of arrow attacks designed to provoke the heavy Frankish cavalry into breaking formation and charging into ground where they could be surrounded and cut down. Richard forbade the charge. For 3 weeks, under constant attack in the summer heat, his army held formation and kept moving. On the 7th of September, 1191, at the coastal plain north of the town of Arsuf, Saladin committed his full army to a pitched battle, gambling that the accumulated pressure on the column had weakened it enough to break. The Hospitallers, forming the rear guard, had absorbed the heaviest of the attacks for days and were at the limit of their endurance. 2 of their knights broke and charged without orders, and the charge became general before Richard could stop it. What he could do and did immediately was commit his cavalry to support the charge rather than let it become an isolated rout. The Crusader cavalry struck Saladin's army in a coordinated wave that it had no time to resist. The Muslim forces broke. Saladin's army retreated with serious casualties, its morale damaged for the first time in the campaign. Richard had turned a loss of discipline into a victory through the speed of his reaction. Arsuf proved that Saladin's army could be beaten in open field. It also established Richard, in the eyes of friend and enemy alike, as the most dangerous commander in the Holy Land. The army took Jaffa in September and began the business of deciding what came next. Jerusalem was the goal. It was always the goal, the emotional and spiritual purpose of everything the crusade had done. It was also, by Richard's assessment, unattainable. Jerusalem lay inland, 25 miles from the coast, in terrain that Saladin controlled. Any army that moved on Jerusalem without securing its supply lines would face the same trap that had destroyed the army at Hatton, cut off from water, surrounded by cavalry, unable to retreat. Richard said this to his council of war repeatedly, in November of 1191 and again in January of 1192. The council voted to advance anyway. Richard advanced with them. The army reached Beit Nuba in January 1192, 12 miles from Jerusalem, close enough for scouts to see the city's towers on the horizon. Saladin, inside Jerusalem, was preparing for the worst. His own chronicler records that the Sultan wept in the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Friday prayers, convinced the city was about to fall. Richard called a council of war. The Templars, the Hospitallers, and the local Crusader barons, the men who actually had to live in this land after the European kings went home, voted against the assault. Their argument was the same one Richard had been making for weeks. Jerusalem could be taken but not held. Without Saladin's power base in Egypt destroyed, any Christian garrison in Jerusalem would be surrounded and starved within months. Richard accepted their judgment, turned the army around, and marched back to the coast. It was the most agonizing decision of the crusade, and it split the army politically for the remainder of the campaign. Philip of France had already gone home, citing illness. His departure had stripped the crusade of a third of its fighting strength and left Richard as the de facto commander of an army that was increasingly exhausted, politically divided, and running out of the cohesion that had made it formidable. Through the spring and summer of 1192, Richard fought a series of engagements across southern Palestine, fortifying Ascalon, raiding Saladin's supply convoys from Egypt, and generally making the Sultan's position more expensive to maintain. In July, news arrived from England that his brother John, in alliance with Philip of France, was threatening Richard's own kingdom. The crusade had a clock on it that had nothing to do with Jerusalem. In late July 1192, Saladin moved on Jaffa, attacking the city while Richard was at Acre, planning his return to England. The garrison held the citadel but lost the town. A messenger swam out through the harbor to find the Crusader fleet and report. Richard arrived by sea, waded ashore through the surf, personally leading his knights, drove the Muslim forces from the town in a matter of hours, and re-established the Christian position before Saladin could consolidate his gains. Days later, Saladin's army, more than 7,000 cavalry, perhaps twice as many infantry, attacked Richard's camp at dawn. Richard organized his defense with 80 knights and approximately 2,000 crossbowmen, arranged in a formation that forced the attacking cavalry to advance into sustained fire before engaging the infantry. Saladin's army could not break through. The assault failed. Richard then led his handful of knights in a charge along the length of the Muslim line, and Saladin's own biographer, who was present and watching from horseback, records that not one man challenged him. The Battle of Jaffa was the last engagement of the Third Crusade. Both sides had reached the limits of what they could sustain. Saladin's coalition was held together by his personal authority, and the exhaustion of his emirs was visible. Richard's army was depleted, his English kingdom endangered, and his own health had been failing for weeks. On the 2nd of September, 1192, Richard and Saladin's representatives signed the Treaty of Jaffa, a 3-year truce that left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, returned Ascalon to Saladin, confirmed Crusader control of the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, and guaranteed Christian pilgrims free and protected access to the Holy City. It was not what either side had wanted. It was what the situation permitted. Richard left the Holy Land on the 9th of October, 1192, without entering Jerusalem. He had made a specific and principled decision not to. He had been offered a safe conduct to visit the city as a pilgrim, protected by Saladin's guarantee. He declined. To enter Jerusalem as anything other than its conqueror, he said, was not something he was willing to do. Whether this was genuine conviction or political theater, the refusal cost him something real, the sight of the city that the entire crusade had been built to recover. He sailed away, having never seen it. Saladin died on the 4th of March, 1193, less than 6 months after the treaty was signed. He died in Damascus, in the gardens of his palace, having given away so much of his personal wealth over the years that his treasury could not cover the cost of his burial. His empire began to fragment within days of his death, his sons and lieutenants dividing the territories he had spent 2 decades unifying. The man who had defined himself by the recovery of Jerusalem lived only long enough to negotiate its retention. The man who had come closer than anyone to taking it back sailed away, still carrying the intention to return with a better army and finish what the Third Crusade had started. He never came back. What the Third Crusade had achieved was not nothing, though it was less than either side's ambitions had demanded. The Crusader kingdom, which had been reduced to a single city after Hattin, now held a viable coastal strip, a functioning capital at Acre, and the island of Cyprus as a permanent strategic base. Saladin had failed to exterminate the Latin presence in the Levant. Richard had failed to recover Jerusalem. The two most capable commanders of their generation had fought each other to a draw, and the draw had preserved the Crusader states for another century, while also demonstrating, clearly and permanently, that Jerusalem could not be taken from a Muslim ruler of Saladin's caliber by any army Europe had yet managed to put in the field. The question that no one in 1192 could quite bring themselves to ask directly was whether Jerusalem was worth the price it kept demanding. Every crusade had cost more than the last. Every generation of men who had marched east had left a larger portion of their number in the soil of Anatolia, Syria, and Palestine. The institution kept producing armies, kept issuing indulgences, kept insisting that the cause was just and the victory was imminent, kept finding in each failure the evidence of insufficient faith rather than impossible odds. The system was still running. It would run for another 100 years. But after the Third Crusade, after the extraordinary abilities of Richard and Saladin had met and canceled each other out, the gap between the crusading ideal and the crusading reality had never been wider, and the men who understood this most clearly were the ones who had been there. Among those men, in the autumn of 1192, was a young German nobleman who had participated in the campaign and watched Frederick Barbarossa's disciplined army disintegrate after his death, who had been present at Acre, and who had seen the political divisions between Christian leaders squander every military advantage Richard created. His name was not yet famous. It would be 30 years later when he put into practice everything the Third Crusade had taught him and recovered Jerusalem without firing a single arrow. But that belongs to the story of what the Crusades became, not what they had been. What they had been, across the century from Clermont to Jaffa, was something the popular story on neither side has ever fully captured. Not a crime, not a triumph. Not the inevitable clash of civilizations that both the apologists and the prosecutors want it to be. Something more specific, more human, and more instructive than any of those framings. The product of two societies, both expanding, both certain of their divine mandate, meeting at the intersection of geography and history, and finding that neither had the resources to destroy the other. The world they made between them, in the century of the Crusades, was not the world either had intended. It never is. The system had produced its outcome. The outcome had its own logic. And the question of what that outcome means, whether it was worth the cost, whether it was justified, whether it changed anything that mattered, is the question this entire journey has been building toward. Jerusalem was taken. Jerusalem was lost. Another century of campaigns would follow, each less successful than the last, each drawing on the same ideology, the same institutional machinery, the same promise that this time God would provide what the previous generation had squandered. They did not get Jerusalem back. What they got instead is the question that closes this story. What did it all mean? What was it actually for? And standing on the far side of 1,000 years, with everything the Crusades produced visible in the historical record, the institutions, the casualties, the debts, the architecture, the hatreds, and the extraordinary, brutal, entirely human drama of people doing exactly what their world had built them to do, what is the honest verdict? What the Crusades were, what they cost, and what they actually built across 2 centuries of campaigns, papal bulls, broken treaties, and the slow collapse of every state they had created, is a question that demands an honest accounting. Not the accounting of the apologists, who see only the provocation and the faith. Not the accounting of the prosecutors, who see only the violence and the greed. The accounting of a system that produced exactly what it was designed to produce, and left a world that no one inside it had intended or foreseen. The century after Richard and Saladin produced 4 more major crusades, each of which illuminates a different failure mode of the institution. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never came within 1,000 miles of Jerusalem. Intended as an assault on Egypt, the correct strategic target that Richard himself had identified, it was diverted by debt, opportunity, and the calculating hand of Venice into an attack on Constantinople instead. In April of 1204, the armies of the Cross broke into the greatest Christian city in the world, plundered it for 3 days, and installed a Latin emperor in the palace of the Byzantine emperors. The city that had stood for nearly 900 years as the eastern bulwark of Christendom was broken by the men who were supposed to be defending it. Pope Innocent III, who had called the crusade, condemned the sack in language of barely contained fury. The condemnation changed nothing. The Crusaders kept the plunder. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not an accident or an aberration. It was the logical outcome of a system that had always contained within itself the tension between the ideological purpose of the crusade and the material interests of the people conducting it. The knights who broke into the Hagia Sophia and stripped its altar were not betraying the crusading ideal. They were expressing a part of it that had always been present, the part that understood war as an opportunity, that had taken the county of Edessa and the principality of Antioch and called them the will of God. The Fourth Crusade simply made visible what had been implicit from the beginning. The Sixth Crusade, launched in 1228, produced the most extraordinary outcome in the history of the movement. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, excommunicated by the Pope at the time he conducted it. A man whose religious heterodoxy and friendly relations with Muslim scholars had scandalized Orthodox. Christendom negotiated directly with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil and secured by treaty the return of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and a corridor to the sea. No blood was shed. The city's Muslim inhabitants retained their rights. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque remained in Muslim hands. Jerusalem was Christian again, recovered without a single battle by the one crusader the Church had officially declared damned. The response to this achievement tells you everything about the institution it challenged. The Church condemned it. The military orders refused to honor it. The Patriarch of Jerusalem placed the city under interdict rather than celebrate Frederick's success. The logic was impeccable within its own frame. A crusade conducted by an excommunicated emperor was theologically illegitimate, regardless of what it accomplished. But the practical result was that the institution destroyed the most successful crusading outcome since 1192 through sheer ideological refusal. Jerusalem reverted to Muslim control 10 years later, when the truce expired, and no one had the will or the resources to renew it. The system had eaten its own success. The later Crusades, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, followed a pattern of diminishing return and accelerating institutional decay. Louis IX of France, the most genuinely pious crusader since Raymond of Toulouse, led 2 of them and was captured in Egypt during the first and died of dysentery in North Africa during the second. He was canonized for it. The crusading ideal, by the mid-13th century, had become so detached from military reality that it was sustained largely by the prestige of the men who died attempting it, rather than by any serious expectation of victory. The machinery kept running because the machinery had its own interests. The papacy needed the revenue from crusade taxation. The military orders needed the institutional purpose that only a living crusade could provide. And the monarchs of Europe found crusade vows useful diplomatic instruments, regardless of whether they intended to honor them. The Mamluk sultans of Egypt ended the argument. Harder and more efficient than the Ayyubids who had preceded them, the Mamluks systematically reduced the Crusader coastal cities through the last decades of the 13th century. Caesarea fell in 1265. Arsuf in 1265. Jaffa in 1268. Antioch in 1268. The principality that Bohemond had carved out through treachery and genius in 1098, which had survived nearly 2 centuries of pressure, fell in a single assault. On the 18th of May, 1291, the last major Crusader city fell. Acre, the wealthiest port in the eastern Mediterranean, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem since 1187, the city Richard had taken from Saladin exactly 100 years before, was overrun by the Mamluk army of al-Ashraf Khalil. The fighting lasted most of the day. The remaining Crusaders who could reach the harbor escaped by sea. Those who could not were killed or enslaved. The Latin East, which had existed for 192 years, was over. The question of what the Crusades achieved depends entirely on where you stand when you ask it. From the perspective of the men who launched them, the popes, the princes, the knights who sold their estates and marched east, the answer is a qualified failure. Jerusalem was held for 88 years, lost, briefly recovered by negotiation, lost again, and never regained. The military orders survived the fall of Acre but had no purpose without a Holy Land to defend. The papacy, which had used the Crusades for 2 centuries as the primary instrument of its political authority, had so overextended and debased that instrument through the Fourth Crusade, through crusades against Christian heretics in France, through crusades against the papacy's own political enemies in Italy, that its moral authority was largely spent. The Crusades did not save Christendom from Islam. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, 162 years after the fall of Acre, and no crusade came to stop it. But step back further, and the picture changes. The 2 centuries of crusading contact between the Latin West and the Islamic East produced consequences that neither side had intended, and both sides still live with. The military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, developed the institutional infrastructure of European banking, international finance, and legal complexity that would eventually become the framework of modern commercial law. The taxation systems developed to fund the Crusades were the first pan-European fiscal mechanisms, the ancestors of the national tax systems that made the modern state possible. The contact with Islamic scholarship, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy accelerated the intellectual transformation of Europe that culminated in the Renaissance. The spice trade routes that the Crusaders never quite managed to control were eventually taken by sea by the Portuguese and Spanish, producing the age of exploration. The world the Crusades made was not the world anyone in it had tried to make. Now consider the question that the search data tells us is the one most people actually want answered. Were the Crusades justified? It is the right question, and it deserves a serious answer rather than a deflection into relativism. Here is the honest one. The Crusades were a response to a real and documented series of losses, territorial, commercial, spiritual, political, that the Christian world had been absorbing for 4 centuries before Urban spoke at Clermont. The threat was not imaginary. The losses were not trivial. A civilization that had watched its holiest city, its wealthiest provinces, and its most vital sea routes pass under hostile control, that had seen Arab raiders plunder the churches of Rome and Seljuk cavalry overrun the heartland of Byzantium, had genuine reasons to believe that its survival required a military response. The men who answered the call at Clermont were not paranoid fanatics. They were people acting on the logic of the world they inhabited, with the tools that world had given them. And yet, the Rhineland massacres of 1096 happened before a single crusader had faced a Muslim soldier. Thousands of Jewish men, women, and children killed by men who believed they were doing God's work, condemned by the institution that had inspired them, and impossible to stop once the machinery of holy war had been set in motion. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 was brutal by any standard, carried out by men who wept at the Holy Sepulchre an hour after the killing ended. The piety and the violence inseparable products of the same formation. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 destroyed the city that had stood as Christianity's greatest monument and eastern shield, destroyed by Christians. For reasons that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with debt and Venetian commercial ambition, the system that had been built to defend Christendom ate it instead. This is the tension that neither the defenders nor the critics of the Crusades will hold simultaneously, because holding it simultaneously is uncomfortable. The Crusades were a justified response to a real threat, conducted through methods that produced atrocities, driven by genuine faith that was exploited by institutional interests, achieving military outcomes that were gradually undone by the same structural failures that had produced the need for them in the first place. They were not a crime, and they were not a triumph. They were what happens when a system under pressure generates a response that is simultaneously necessary and uncontrollable, when the ideology that makes action possible also makes the action impossible to govern once it begins. The men who marched from Clermont to Jerusalem and back across the centuries were not different from us in any way that matters. They lived in a world that had given them a story about God, about history, about what their civilization was and what it owed to itself, and they acted on that story with the full force of everything they believed. Some of what they did was extraordinary. Some of what they did was inexcusable. Most of what they did was entirely human, the product of fear and faith and ambition, and the institutional machinery that channels all three into organized violence and calls it divine will. Every civilization that has ever held power has done this. The Crusades are not unique in this. What makes them worth understanding, 1,000 years after Clermont, is that they are unusually well documented, and in that documentation, you can watch the gap between the ideal and the reality open, widen, and finally swallow the whole enterprise, exactly as it does in every human system that mistakes its own righteousness for the will of God. The pilgrims who came to Jerusalem in the decades after 1291, and they kept coming. Because Jerusalem remained open to Christian visitors under the terms that the Crusades had eventually produced, found a city that had changed hands a dozen times and wore every occupation in its stones. They found churches built over the ruins of older churches, mosques built over the ruins of churches, the layers of competing sacred claims stacked on top of each other like geological strata. They found a city that had been fought over for 2 centuries at incalculable human cost, and was, in the end, simply itself, old, holy, indifferent to the ambitions of the armies that had broken themselves against its walls. Jerusalem had survived everything the Crusades could bring to it. It would survive what came after. It always has. The story that began on a wooden platform outside a cathedral in Clermont in 1095 ends here not with a verdict of guilty or not guilty, not with a declaration that the Crusades were justified or unjustified, but with the recognition that they were the product of a world, that the world that produced them was real, and that the men who answered the call were doing what their world had built them to do. Understanding that is not the same as approving it. It is something more difficult and more useful than approval. It is the thing that history is actually for the ability to look at what human beings have done and understand, with full honesty, how they came to do it. Not so that we can excuse it, so that we can recognize it when it happens again.